Professor of Ancient Philosophy at King's College London. She's written voluminously on Plato, Aristotle and all of their predecessors. She supervised the PhD of our very own Jonas Green here, and as President of the British Philosophical Association, she's perhaps one of the most important philosophers in both the public and the academic spheres. Without any further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor MM McCabe.
Right. Okay. I'll do my best. So I wanted to think about the stories we tell ourselves, by virtue of which we try and understand ourselves. We do it all the time. You tell stories about yourself, you tell stories to others, but they're just stories, but they're all designed somehow or other to make you think about how you understand yourself. So, when I was a child, my mother used to read me the Kipling Just So stories. And one of my favourites is the story of the elephant's child, which I put on your handout. In the high and far off times, the elephant, oh best beloved, had no trunk. He had only a blackish, bulgy nose as big as a boot, that he could wriggle about from side to side, but he couldn't pick up things with it. But there was one a new elephant, an elephant's child, who was full of satiable curiosity. And that means he asked ever so many questions. And he lived in Africa, and he filled all Africa with his satiable curiosities. The elephant's child goes down to the great grey-green, greasy Limpopo River and meets a crocodile, and the crocodile bites his nose, and so it gets lengthened out into a trunk, and the elephant's child discovers how useful a trunk is. The story is a story about elephant nature, if you like, and it's designed to explain things to us by appealing to what we understand. And what we understand is that some child might be full of tedious, constant questions. He always says, why do we do this, why do we do that? The story works because it appeals to something that's familiar. Those kinds of stories turn up everywhere. They don't just turn up in philosophy, they turn up in literature, they turn up in every course, they turn up in medicine, for example. The use of narrative in medicine is an important feature of how medical diagnosis works. In philosophy, they turn up very often as state of nature stories, for example. The story about Gyges' ring in the Republic, in Plato's Republic, where Gyges finds a ring that if he turns it round, he becomes suddenly invisible. And he can do whatever he wants. So he does. He does all sorts of unbelievably appalling, horrible things. And the puzzle is how, if you were given the power of invisibility, anybody else would stop you from doing exactly what you want to. The Gyges' ring story supposes something in particular about what we assume about human nature, that we're all really vile underneath. Right? So if you were, I mean, think about it, if you were invisible and you could do whatever you like, there is a question, sorry, this is a kind of footnote. If you discover a ring that when it turns around you suddenly become invisible, how do you know you're invisible? He seems to know immediately that he's invisible. I'll come back to that sort of question in a minute. So the Gyges' ring story, like the elephant story about the elephant's child, makes an assumption in order for the story to work and in order for the story to provide us with the underlying question of Plato's Republic, which is how can you explain political institutions, how can you explain our interest in justice, if in fact we'd all, if we were invisible, grab everybody else's wives and husbands and fast cars. So it makes an assumption about what you might think of as moral psychology. It makes an assumption about how we really are underneath. And the story, the state of nature story, is supposed to give us an account about how we are underneath is connected to our political institutions, the way the political institutions should work. The same thing happens in John Rawls' huge book, A Theory of Justice, a book which changed the face, I think, of political theory in the 20th century. Whether that's necessarily a good thing, I'm not sure, but it certainly was one of the most influential books of the 20th century in political thought. And the way that Rawls starts out by trying to explain political institutions is by a thought experiment, which is the same sort of genre of story. So you have to imagine a whole series of rational people. And they're rational and they know all sorts of general things, and their job is to sit, as he describes it, in the original position, behind a veil of ignorance. There's a whole lot of apparatus in this story. And the veil of ignorance means that they're not able to tell in advance which position in the society that they're legislating for they themselves will occupy. And the consequence of that, it's very much like the strategy that Plato deploys, the consequence of that is that the political institutions they develop are ones that are risk-aversive. So they don't allow them to... The people behind the veil of ignorance don't generate a political structure that has gross inequalities, just in case they might be in a really rubbish position when it turned out, because they don't know which position they're going to be in. Once again, notice what happens. So you can see that rationality makes them risk-aversive. Rationality makes them choose equality under those situations because of the assumptions that Rawls makes from the outset about how we really are. And he supposes from the outset that how we really are is driven to our own interest, driven to pursuing what's mine, not what's anybody else's. That's where he thinks we might begin the story. In all of these cases, what we're trying to do with these stories or thought experiments or whatever they are, what we're trying to do is to get beyond what we can see or test. We're trying to imagine the inaccessible, and in doing that, what we do is try and start with something that we think is somehow or other the lowest common denominator. So you imagine that people are as horrible as possible. You imagine that we really are real stinkers. And so, because we're real stinkers, we've got to have political institutions that stop us behaving in those ways. So it's a kind of flattening of our aspirations for ourselves that we suppose that we start out in a state of nature as a matter of natural truth, as gross or base egoists. Now, once philosophy in this way gets hold of the thought experiment, she gets a little overexcited about it, and you'll find that there are all sorts of canonical thought experiments in philosophy which, as it were,